She thought she was texting a fashion designer who could change her life. Instead, the message landed in the hands of a man who would change everything she thought she knew about love, betrayal, and second chances. What started as a simple mistake that night became the beginning of a story that would prove some wrong numbers are exactly right. This is the true story of how one text message rewrote two destinies forever. It was a Tuesday evening in September when Sarah Mitchell sat on the edge of her worn-out couch in her small Brooklyn apartment, staring at a piece of crumpled paper in her hand. The number was scrawled hastily, almost illegibly, in blue ink. Her best friend Jessica had given it to her 3 days ago at the coffee shop where they usually met every week. Jessica worked as a receptionist at a boutique fashion studio in Manhattan, and she'd been raving about this designer, someone she called Marcus, who apparently helped young designers get their start in the industry. Sarah had been working as a seamstress at a dry cleaning shop for 4 years, taking night classes in fashion design and sketching dress patterns in notebooks she kept hidden under her bed. She'd always dreamed of something more, something beyond fixing hems and replacing buttons for customers who barely looked at her when they picked up their clothes. Jessica had promised her that this Marcus guy was different, that he actually cared about helping people with real talent, not just those who could afford expensive design schools. Sarah read the number again, her thumb hovering over her phone screen. She'd rewritten it into her contacts but hadn't worked up the courage to send the message yet. What would she even say? How do you introduce yourself to someone who might hold the key to everything you've ever wanted? She took a deep breath and started typing. Her fingers moved slowly at first, then with more confidence as the words began to flow. She wrote about her passion for design, about the sketches she'd been working on, about how she'd taught herself to drape fabric and construct patterns by watching videos online and studying books from the library. She kept it professional, but let a little bit of her personality shine through, hoping it would be enough to get his attention. When she finally pressed send, she felt a strange mixture of relief and terror wash over her. The message was out there now, floating through the digital void, carrying all her hopes with it. Across the city, in a penthouse overlooking Central Park, Daniel Crawford sat in his home office, the lights of Manhattan twinkling below him like a galaxy laid out at his feet. The room was all dark wood and leather, the kind of space that screamed success and money. But it felt empty tonight, like it always did. He'd just finished a conference call with investors in Singapore, and his head was pounding from the combination of stress and the scotch he'd been nursing for the past hour. At 38 years old, Daniel had built an empire in commercial real estate development, turning abandoned warehouses into luxury condos and transforming struggling neighborhoods into thriving communities. The business magazines called him a visionary, a self-made billionaire who'd started with nothing and built everything through sheer determination and an almost supernatural ability to see potential where others saw only problems. But those articles never mentioned the cost of that success, the relationships that had crumbled under the weight of his ambition, or the fact that he went home to an empty apartment every night despite being surrounded by people all day long. His phone buzzed on the desk, cutting through the silence. He glanced at it, expecting another email from his assistant or perhaps a late-night message from one of his business partners in London. Instead, he saw a text from an unknown number. He almost deleted it without reading, assuming it was spam or a wrong number, but something made him pause. Maybe it was the scotch, or maybe it was the particular brand of loneliness that settles in when you realize you have everything except the things that actually matter. He opened the message and started reading. The words were earnest, almost painfully sincere, from someone named Sarah, who thought she was writing to a fashion designer named Marcus. She wrote about her dreams with a kind of raw honesty that felt foreign to him, so different from the carefully calculated communications he dealt with every day in his business. There was no agenda here, no hidden motive, just someone reaching out with genuine hope and vulnerability. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Daniel set his phone down and stared at it for a long moment. The smart thing would be to ignore it, to let this Sarah person know she had the wrong number and move on with his evening. But he found himself picking up the phone again, his thumbs hovering over the keyboard. He typed out a response, deleted it, typed again. Finally, he settled on something simple and honest. He told her she had the wrong number, but asked what kind of designs she worked on. He wasn't sure why he was engaging with a complete stranger at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, but in that moment, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. He hit send before he could second-guess himself, and waited. The response came faster than he expected. Sarah apologized profusely for the mistake, clearly embarrassed, but when he asked about her work, she opened up again. She told him about a dress design she'd been sketching, inspired by the way light filtered through the trees in Prospect Park. She described it with such vivid detail that he could almost see it, this creation that existed only in her imagination and on paper. They texted back and forth for the next hour, the conversation flowing easily despite the bizarre circumstances of how it started. Daniel found himself smiling at her messages, at the way she described her tiny apartment as cozy instead of cramped, at how she talked about her dreams without any trace of entitlement or expectation. She asked him what he did for work, and he hesitated before answering. He'd learned over the years that telling people about his wealth changed how they saw him, changed how they acted around him. So he told her a version of the truth that was easier to digest. He said he worked in property development, which was technically accurate, and left out the part about the private jets and the Forbes profile. She seemed satisfied with that answer and didn't push for details, which he appreciated more than she could know. When they finally said goodnight, Daniel sat back in his leather chair and realized he felt lighter than he had in months, maybe years. Over the following weeks, their connection deepened. They texted every day, sometimes just brief exchanges, other times long conversations that stretched into the early hours of the morning. They talked about everything and nothing, sharing stories from their childhoods, debating their favorite movies, discussing books they'd read and places they wanted to visit someday. Sarah found herself opening up to this stranger in ways she hadn't with anyone else, telling him about her father who'd left when she was 12, about her mother who worked double shifts as a nurse and still barely made ends meet, about the scholarship she'd lost in her sophomore year of college that had forced her to drop out and start working full-time. Daniel, for his part, found himself being more honest than he'd been in years. He told her about growing up in a trailer park in Ohio, about working 3 jobs to put himself through community college before transferring to a state university on a partial scholarship. He talked about the first property he'd ever bought, a run-down duplex that everyone told him was a waste of money, and how fixing it up and renting it out had been the beginning of everything. He left out the part about how that single duplex had grown into a portfolio worth billions, how he now owned entire city blocks and had investors begging him to take their money. She knew he was successful, he'd mentioned that much, but he let her assume he was maybe a mid-level project manager or a small-time property investor. It felt good to be seen as just Dan, not Daniel Crawford the billionaire. 3 months after their first conversation, Sarah's life took a difficult turn. She came home from work one evening to find an eviction notice taped to her apartment door. Her landlord was selling the building, and all the tenants had 60 days to find new places to live. Sarah stood in the hallway holding that piece of paper, feeling the world tilt beneath her feet. She'd been barely making rent as it was, and the cost of finding a new apartment in New York, even in the outer boroughs, felt impossible. She went inside and sat on her couch, the same couch where she'd sent that first text to Dan, and let herself cry for the first time in months. When she finally pulled herself together, she did what had become natural to her. She texted Dan. She told him everything about the eviction notice, about how scared she was, about how she was starting to wonder if maybe she should just give up on New York and move back to her hometown in Pennsylvania, where at least the cost of living was manageable, even if it meant giving up on her dreams. Daniel read her message and felt something crack open in his chest. He was sitting in his office, supposed to be reviewing contracts for a new development project, but all he could think about was Sarah sitting alone in her apartment, crying over circumstances that were completely out of her control. He wanted to fix it for her, wanted to write a check that would solve all her problems in an instant, but he knew that would reveal everything he'd been hiding. It would change the dynamic between them, would make her feel indebted to him, or worse, would make her question whether anything between them had been real. So instead, Daniel did something more thoughtful. He listened. He stayed on the phone with her for 3 hours that night. They'd graduated from texting to actual phone calls a few weeks earlier, and he let her talk through her fears and frustrations. He helped her make a plan, encouraged her to look for roommate situations that might be more affordable, reminded her that setbacks were temporary, but giving up on her dreams would be permanent. Over the next few weeks, Daniel watched as Sarah fought to keep her life together. She picked up extra shifts at the dry cleaning shop, started selling some of her vintage clothing online to make extra money, spent every free moment searching for an affordable place to live. Through it all, she never complained to him, never asked him for help or money. She just shared her journey with a resilience that made him admire her even more. What Daniel didn't tell her was that he'd been doing some careful investigating. He'd used his resources to learn more about her situation, and he'd made a decision. He couldn't stand by and watch her struggle when he had the means to help, but he also couldn't just throw money at the problem without destroying the foundation of trust they'd built. So Daniel did something that surprised even himself. He created an anonymous grant program through one of his charitable foundations, specifically designed for emerging fashion designers in New York who showed exceptional talent but lacked financial resources. He worked with his foundation director to set up the criteria, making sure Sarah would qualify, but keeping it broad enough that it didn't seem targeted just at her. Then he made sure the information about the grant reached the online communities where young designers congregated, including a forum he knew Sarah frequented. 3 weeks later, Sarah sent him an excited message. She'd found out about this grant program and had submitted an application. She didn't think she'd get it. There were probably hundreds of applicants, but just the possibility of it gave her hope. Daniel smiled at his phone and told her he had a good feeling about it, that sometimes the universe had a way of coming through when you needed it most. 2 weeks after that, Sarah got the call. She'd been selected as one of 3 recipients of the grant, which included $15,000 in financial support, 6 months of mentorship from established designers, and access to a shared studio space in Manhattan. She called Daniel immediately, sobbing with joy and disbelief, unable to process that something this good was actually happening to her. Daniel listened to her celebrate, his heart full in a way he didn't know was possible, satisfied with the knowledge that he'd helped make this happen even if she'd never know it was him. The grant money allowed Sarah to find a small but decent apartment in Queens, close enough to Manhattan that she could access the studio space without spending her whole life on the subway. She quit her job at the dry cleaning shop and threw herself into her design work with a passion and focus that had been impossible when she was working 10-hour shifts 6 days a week. As Sarah's life improved, Daniel found himself falling deeper. Their phone calls became longer, more frequent. They talked every night before bed, their conversations ranging from silly debates about the best pizza toppings to deep discussions about what they wanted from life. Both of them knew that eventually they'd have to address the obvious question. They'd been talking for almost 5 months and had never met in person. Sarah was the one who finally brought it up. It was a Friday night in February, and they'd been on the phone for over an hour. She just asked him straight out. Why hadn't they met yet? Was he married? Was there something she should know? Her tone was light, teasing, but he could hear the real question underneath. Do you actually want this to be real, or are we just playing some extended game of pretend? Daniel felt his stomach drop. This was the moment he'd been both anticipating and dreading. He took a deep breath and told her part of the truth. He said he'd been burned badly in his last relationship, that trusting people had become difficult for him, and that what they had felt precious and fragile, something he didn't want to risk destroying by bringing reality into it too soon. Sarah was quiet for a moment, and then she said she understood, that she'd felt the same way. But she also said she was ready whenever he was, that she wanted to put a face to the voice that had become her favorite sound. Daniel made a decision that night. He would meet her, but he would do it as just Dan, the property development guy she'd been talking to for 5 months, not Daniel Crawford, the billionaire. He'd dress down, drive one of the cars from his collection that looked ordinary, take her somewhere nice but not flashy. He told himself it was to protect what they had, to make sure her feelings for him were real before he revealed the full extent of his circumstances. They made plans to meet the following Saturday for dinner at a small Italian restaurant in the West Village. When Saturday finally arrived, Sarah stood outside the restaurant 15 minutes early, her hands shaking slightly. She'd chosen a dress she'd made herself, a simple design in deep blue, paired with a vintage coat she'd altered to fit perfectly. At exactly 7 o'clock, she saw him walking toward her, and her breath caught. Dan was tall, with dark hair that showed just a touch of gray at the temples, and eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. He was handsome in an understated way, dressed in dark jeans and a button-down shirt under a well-made jacket. When their eyes met, something clicked into place. This was him. This was the person who'd been there for her through one of the hardest periods of her life. They stood there for a moment, just looking at each other, and then Daniel spoke, his voice the same one she'd been falling asleep to on the phone for months. He said her name like it was something precious, and she smiled so wide her cheeks hurt. The dinner was everything Sarah had hoped it would be and more. They talked like they always did, the conversation flowing easily, but now they could see each other's expressions, could watch the way their eyes lit up when discussing something they loved. Daniel was careful to maintain his cover, paying for dinner with cash instead of a credit card that might have his full name on it, steering conversation away from topics that might reveal too much about his actual lifestyle. After dinner, they walked through the village, talking and laughing, their breath visible in the cold February air. When Daniel walked her to the subway station, she found herself not wanting the night to end. They stood at the top of the stairs, and Daniel asked if he could see her again. Sarah laughed and said she'd be disappointed if he didn't. Then Daniel did something that made Sarah's heart skip. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his hand lingering on her cheek for just a moment, and asked if he could kiss her. Sarah nodded, unable to form words, and when his lips met hers, everything else faded away. Over the next 3 months, Sarah and Daniel fell into a pattern. They saw each other every weekend, sometimes just for coffee or a walk in the park, other times for dinner or exploring different neighborhoods in the city. Sarah introduced Daniel to her small circle of friends, including Jessica. Daniel was charming and friendly, but he was also careful, always slightly guarded, never revealing too much about himself. The truth came out on a Wednesday afternoon in May. Sarah was having lunch with a colleague from the mentorship program, a designer named Marcus, ironically the same Marcus she'd originally been trying to text that first night. They'd become friends over the past few months. They were sitting at a cafe in Midtown when Marcus suddenly went still, staring at something across the street. Sarah followed his gaze and saw Daniel, her Dan, standing on the sidewalk talking to several men in business suits. But he wasn't dressed like the casual Dan she knew. He was wearing what was obviously a very expensive suit, the kind that's custom-made. He was animated, gesturing as he talked, and even from across the street, Sarah could see he was in his element, commanding and confident in a way she'd never witnessed. Marcus grabbed Sarah's arm and said, "Do you know who that is?" Sarah felt her mouth go dry, and she managed to say yes. "That's Dan, I've been seeing him." Marcus looked at her in shock and said, "Dan? That's Daniel Crawford. He owns half the commercial real estate in Manhattan. He's worth billions, Sarah. There are literally articles about him in Forbes." Sarah felt the world tilt. She just kept staring at Daniel across the street, this man she thought she knew, trying to reconcile him with what Marcus was telling her. Daniel Crawford, billionaire. She thought about all the times he'd paid for dinner in cash, the way he'd been vague about his apartment, the expensive car she'd seen him with once. All the little inconsistencies suddenly made horrible sense. He'd been lying to her for 6 months. Sarah didn't confront him immediately. She went home and spent the evening doing research. She looked up Daniel Crawford online and found dozens of articles about him, photos of him at charity galas and business conferences, profiles that described his empire and his estimated net worth. She read about his ex-fiancée Rebecca and the scandal when she'd left him for his business partner. She learned that he was known for being intensely private, rarely giving interviews, and protecting his personal life fiercely. As Sarah read, her anger began to mix with something else, a dawning understanding of why he might have hidden his identity from her. If he'd been hurt before, if he'd learned that people treated him differently once they knew about his money, maybe his deception wasn't about thinking she was untrustworthy. Maybe it was about protecting himself from being hurt again. But understanding his possible motivations didn't make the betrayal hurt less. That night, when Daniel called her like he always did, Sarah answered but kept the conversation short, said she was tired, wasn't feeling well. The next morning, Sarah texted him and asked if they could meet that evening. She suggested a park bench in Central Park, somewhere public but quiet. Daniel agreed immediately, his stomach knotting with anxiety. When Daniel arrived at the park bench that evening, Sarah was already there, sitting very straight, her hands folded in her lap. He sat down next to her and waited. Sarah took a deep breath and said, "I know who you are, Daniel. Not Dan the property development guy. Daniel Crawford, the billionaire. I know you've been lying to me for 6 months about who you are." Daniel felt his heart sink. He started to speak, to explain, but Sarah held up her hand and said, "Let me finish. I need you to understand how this feels from my side. You let me believe we were on equal footing, that we were just two regular people who happened to connect. You watched me stress about money, about finding an apartment, about whether I could afford to pursue my dreams, and you never once told me the truth about who you are. Do you have any idea how that makes me feel? Like I've been performing in some kind of experiment." Daniel felt each word like a physical blow. He tried to respond, to make her understand. He told her about Rebecca, about how she'd changed once his wealth really started to accumulate, how she'd eventually left him for someone else. He explained that when Sarah had first texted him, when she'd been so genuine and unguarded, he'd been starving for that kind of authentic connection. He said he'd planned to tell her, had wanted to tell her so many times, but he'd been terrified of losing what they had. As he spoke, tears started rolling down Sarah's face. He reached for her hand, but she pulled away, and that small rejection felt like his heart breaking. Sarah said, "I understand why you did it, but don't you see what you've done to me? You've made me question everything about us. Every conversation we had, every moment we shared. I'm now wondering if any of it was real, or if it was all just some billionaire's fantasy about slumming it with regular people. You say you wanted authentic connection, but there's nothing authentic about a relationship built on lies." Daniel felt panic rising in his chest. He asked her what he could do to fix this, how he could prove that his feelings for her were real and had nothing to do with money or power. Sarah looked at him, her eyes red from crying, and said, "I don't know if you can. I need time to think, to figure out if I can get past this. I need you to leave me alone for a while." Daniel wanted to argue, to fight for them, but he could see she was serious. He nodded, defeated, and stood up to leave. Before he walked away, he turned back and said, "Everything I ever told you about my feelings for you was true. The money doesn't change that. I love you, Sarah. I have for months. I should have told you sooner about who I am, and I'm sorry I didn't, but please don't doubt that what we have is real." Sarah didn't respond, just sat there on the bench watching him walk away. Can you imagine finding out that someone you love has been hiding something this big from you? How would you handle discovering that the person you thought you knew was actually living a completely different life? Would you be able to forgive them, or would the betrayal be too much to overcome? The next 2 months were difficult for both of them. Daniel threw himself into work, spending 18-hour days at the office, flying to different cities for deals and meetings, doing anything to avoid the empty silence of his penthouse where Sarah's absence felt overwhelming. He wanted to call her, to text her, to show up at her apartment and beg her to give him another chance, but he forced himself to respect her request for space. He did, however, make sure that her grant was extended, that she had everything she needed to continue pursuing her dreams, doing it anonymously through the foundation so she wouldn't know it was him. Sarah, meanwhile, was struggling with her own conflicted feelings. Part of her was still angry at Daniel for the deception, but another part of her missed him desperately. She missed their late-night phone calls, the way he made her laugh, how he listened to her like what she had to say was the most important thing in the world. She talked to Jessica about it endlessly, trying to work through her feelings. Jessica, who'd initially been suspicious of Daniel, surprised Sarah by becoming his defender. She pointed out that yes, he'd lied, but he'd also been there for Sarah in every way that mattered. He'd encouraged her dreams, supported her emotionally, helped her believe in herself. And he'd done all of that without throwing money at her, without trying to solve her problems with his wealth. That had to mean something, didn't it? Sarah spent long nights thinking about what Jessica had said. She thought about all the conversations she and Daniel had shared, about the person she'd come to know through those late-night phone calls and weekend walks. The Daniel she knew, the man who'd listened to her fears and celebrated her victories, was he really that different from Daniel Crawford the billionaire? Or were they the same person, and she'd just been seeing the version of himself he kept hidden from the rest of the world? She thought about his reasons for hiding his identity, about the ex-fiancé who'd betrayed him, about how lonely it must be to never know if people like you for who you are or what you can provide. Sarah realized that in some ways she and Daniel weren't that different. They'd both been hiding parts of themselves, both been afraid to be fully vulnerable, both been shaped by past hurts that made trust difficult. The difference was that his secret had been bigger, more tangible, harder to overlook. But did that make his feelings any less real? Did the fact that he'd lied about his bank account mean he'd also lied about loving her? Deep down, Sarah knew the answer was no. She'd felt his love in every conversation, every gesture, every moment they'd shared. The love had been real, even if the context surrounding it hadn't been completely honest. 3 months after their confrontation in the park, Sarah received an invitation in the mail. It was for a fashion showcase event sponsored by the Crawford Foundation, featuring emerging designers from the mentorship program she was part of. Her work had been selected to be displayed, along with 2 other designers. The invitation didn't mention Daniel's name specifically, but Sarah knew this had to be connected to him somehow. She debated whether to attend, whether seeing him again would set back all the progress she'd made in moving forward. But this was also an incredible opportunity for her career, a chance to show her work to industry professionals and potential buyers. She couldn't let her complicated feelings about Daniel rob her of that. So she decided to go, telling herself she was strong enough to handle whatever happened. The night of the showcase arrived, and Sarah stood in the gallery space watching people admire the dresses she'd created. The collection she'd submitted was called Second Chances, inspired by her own journey over the past year. Each piece represented a different aspect of transformation, of becoming who you're meant to be despite obstacles and setbacks. She was talking to a boutique owner who was interested in carrying her designs when she felt a familiar presence behind her. She turned, and there was Daniel, standing a respectful distance away, looking at her with an expression that made her heart ache. He looked different than she remembered, thinner maybe, with shadows under his eyes that suggested he hadn't been sleeping well. He was wearing a suit, because of course he was. This was his event after all, but he looked uncomfortable in it, like he'd rather be anywhere else. For a long moment they just looked at each other, all the things they hadn't said hanging in the air between them. Then Daniel spoke, his voice quiet enough that only she could hear. He said, "Your work is beautiful, Sarah. I'm so proud of you." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes but blinked them back. She thanked him, keeping her voice professional, trying to maintain the walls she'd built around her heart. But Daniel wasn't done. He asked if they could talk, really talk, after the event was over. He said he understood if she said no, that he'd respect whatever decision she made, but he had some things he needed to say to her. Sarah hesitated, torn between the part of her that wanted to protect herself from more hurt and the part that had never stopped loving him. Finally, she nodded. They agreed to meet at the same bench in Central Park where they'd had their confrontation, a location that felt fitting for whatever this conversation would be. 2 hours later, Sarah found Daniel sitting on that bench, staring out at the park, his hands clasped between his knees. She sat down next to him, leaving space between them, and waited for him to speak. Daniel took a deep breath and began. He told her that the past 3 months had been the worst of his life, worse even than when Rebecca had left him, because losing Sarah felt like losing a part of himself. He said he'd had a lot of time to think about what had happened between them, about the choices he'd made and the pain he'd caused. He admitted that hiding his identity had been cowardly, that he'd let his fear of being hurt again hurt the one person who'd actually seen him, really seen him, for who he was. He said he understood if she couldn't forgive him, if the trust between them was too broken to repair, but he needed her to know that everything they'd shared had been real. The conversations, the connection, the love, all of it had been the most authentic thing in his life. He told her that meeting her had changed him, had reminded him that walls built to protect your heart also keep out all the good things worth living for. Sarah listened to every word, her own heart breaking and healing at the same time. When he finished, there was silence, just the sound of the city around them and their own breathing. Sarah spoke, her voice soft but steady. She told Daniel that she'd been angry at him, furious even, not just because he'd lied, but because his lie had made her doubt herself. She'd wondered if she'd been naive, if she'd missed obvious signs, if she was the kind of person who could be so easily fooled. But over time, she'd realized something important. She said that yes, he'd lied about his circumstances, but he'd told her the truth about everything that mattered. The stories about his childhood, his dreams, his fears, his hopes, those had all been real. The support he'd given her, the encouragement, the way he'd believed in her when she couldn't believe in herself, that had been real too. She told him she understood why he'd done it, even if she didn't agree with how he'd handled it. She said that she'd thought a lot about trust, about what it means to truly know someone, and she'd realized that knowing how much money someone has in their bank account doesn't tell you anything about who they are as a person. She'd known Daniel, the real Daniel, the one who stayed on the phone with her until 3 in the morning, who remembered little details about her life, who made her laugh when she wanted to cry. That person was real, whether his name was Dan or Daniel, whether he lived in a modest apartment or a penthouse overlooking Central Park. Then Sarah said something that made Daniel's breath catch. She said, "I think the real question isn't whether I can forgive you for lying to me. I think the real question is whether we can build something honest together, starting now, with both of us being completely truthful about who we are and what we want." Daniel looked at her, hardly daring to hope. He asked what she was saying, and Sarah smiled, really smiled, for the first time since that awful day at the cafe. She said she was saying that she loved him too, that she had for months, maybe from that very first conversation when a wrong number had turned into the right connection. She said she was scared, terrified actually, of what it would mean to be with someone whose life was so different from hers, someone who lived in a world she didn't understand. But she was also scared of the alternative, of walking away from something real because it was complicated and messy and didn't look the way she'd expected love to look. Daniel reached for her hand, and this time she didn't pull away. He interlaced his fingers with hers and said, "I want to do this right. I want to be honest with you about everything, even the parts that might be difficult or uncomfortable. I want you to see my real life, meet the people in my world, understand what being with me would actually look like. And if at any point it's too much, if you decide this isn't what you want, I'll understand. But I hope you'll give us a chance." Sarah squeezed his hand and said she wanted that too. They sat there on the bench, hands clasped, both of them knowing that this was a new beginning, not a return to what they'd had before. What they were building now would be different, more honest, more real in its complications. Over the following months, Daniel kept his promise. He introduced Sarah to his world gradually, taking her to his penthouse, letting her see how he actually lived, bringing her to business events and introducing her to his colleagues. It was overwhelming at times, the wealth and the attention and the expectations that came with being Daniel Crawford's girlfriend. There were photographers who tried to take their picture, society pages that wanted to write about them, people who suddenly wanted to be Sarah's friend because of who she was dating. It was uncomfortable and strange, and there were moments when Sarah wondered if she'd made the right choice. But Daniel was there through all of it, patient and understanding, never pushing her to be someone she wasn't, always making sure she knew that she could step back anytime she needed to. And slowly, Sarah found her footing. She realized that she didn't have to become someone different to be part of Daniel's life. She could still be herself, the girl from Brooklyn who made her own dresses and got excited about finding good deals at thrift stores. Daniel loved her for that, not despite it. Her authenticity, her groundedness, was exactly what he needed in his life. A year after they'd reconciled, Daniel did something that surprised everyone, including Sarah. He organized a fashion showcase specifically for her work, a solo show that would launch her as a designer in her own right. He didn't do it secretly this time. He told her up front what he wanted to do and asked if she'd let him support her career in this way. Sarah was hesitant at first, worried about what people would say, about whether her success would be seen as legitimate or just a result of dating a billionaire, but Daniel helped her see that accepting help didn't diminish her talent or her hard work. He reminded her that every successful person had support along the way, whether it came in the form of family money or connections or scholarships or mentors. There was no shame in accepting the advantages that came into your life as long as you used them to create something meaningful. The night of Sarah's showcase, the gallery was packed with buyers, fashion editors, and industry professionals. Sarah stood near the entrance, watching people admire the collection she'd poured her heart into, feeling proud and terrified and grateful all at once. Daniel stood beside her, not front and center but slightly behind, making it clear that this was her night, her achievement, her moment to shine. As the evening wound down and the crowd began to thin, Daniel asked Sarah to look at one final piece in the collection, a dress at the back of the gallery that she hadn't noticed before. Confused, Sarah walked toward it, and as she got closer, she realized it wasn't one of her designs. It was a wedding dress, simple and elegant, exactly the style she'd once described to Daniel during one of their late-night phone calls months ago. Sarah turned around to ask Daniel what was happening and found him on one knee, holding a ring. The remaining people in the gallery had gathered around, but Sarah barely noticed them. All she could see was Daniel, the man who'd accidentally received her message over a year ago, and had somehow become the most important person in her life. Daniel spoke, his voice clear and steady. He said that the best mistake he'd ever made was responding to her text that night, and the worst mistake he'd ever made was not being honest with her from the start. He said he'd learned from that, had learned that love required vulnerability and trust, and the courage to be fully seen, even when it was scary. He told her that she'd taught him how to hope again, how to trust again, how to believe that real connection was possible. He said that every day with her felt like a gift, and he wanted to spend the rest of his life earning her trust and making her happy. Then he asked her to marry him, to take a chance on building a life together, messy and complicated and real. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as she looked at this man who'd started as a wrong number and had become her right person. She thought about everything they'd been through, all the mistakes and misunderstandings and moments of grace that had brought them to this point. She thought about the girl who'd sent that nervous text message from her cramped Brooklyn apartment, never imagining where that simple act would lead. And she realized that sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected places, from the moments when plans go wrong and destiny steps in. Sarah said yes, and as Daniel slipped the ring on her finger and pulled her into his arms, the small crowd erupted in applause. But Sarah barely heard them. All she could focus on was the feeling of being held by someone who truly knew her, who'd seen her at her worst and her best, and loved her through all of it. 6 months later, Sarah and Daniel were married in a ceremony that perfectly reflected who they were as a couple. It wasn't the massive society wedding that many people expected. Instead, they chose an intimate gathering at a renovated warehouse in Brooklyn, one of Daniel's early development projects that held special meaning for him. The space was decorated simply but beautifully, with flowers from the local market, and lights strung overhead that made everything glow. Sarah wore a dress she'd designed herself, elegant and understated, with small details that told their story, tiny embroidered text messages hidden in the hem, where only she would know to look for them. Daniel cried when he saw her walking down the aisle, not caring who witnessed his emotion. Jessica was Sarah's maid of honor, and she gave a speech about wrong numbers and right timing that had everyone laughing and crying at the same time. She talked about how skeptical she'd been of Daniel at first, but how he'd proven himself by showing up for Sarah in every way that mattered. She said that their love story was proof that sometimes the universe has better plans for us than we have for ourselves, and that the key is being brave enough to follow where it leads. Daniel's best man, a childhood friend from Ohio named Mike, gave a speech about how he'd watched Daniel build an empire, but had never seen him truly happy until Sarah came into his life. He said Daniel had always been successful, but Sarah had made him rich in the ways that actually mattered. The reception was a blend of both their worlds. There were business moguls and fashion designers sitting next to Sarah's mother and her co-workers from the dry cleaning shop. There were fancy canapes and also pizza from Sarah's favorite Brooklyn place. The first dance was to a song they'd both loved from their late-night phone call days, and as they swayed together, Sarah whispered to Daniel that she couldn't believe this was real, that the scared girl who'd sent that text message had somehow ended up here. Daniel whispered back that he could believe it, that from the moment he'd read her words that night, some part of him had known she was going to change his life. As the night went on and Sarah watched their two worlds blend together seamlessly, she realized something important: the differences between her and Daniel, the things that had seemed so insurmountable when she first learned the truth about him. Those things didn't matter nearly as much as she'd thought they would. What mattered was that they chose each other every day, that they communicated honestly, that they built a relationship based on respect and trust and genuine love. The money was just a circumstance, like any other circumstance a couple has to navigate together. Some couples deal with long distance or different religions or complicated families. She and Daniel dealt with wealth disparity and public attention and learning to exist in each other's worlds. It was challenging sometimes, but it was also beautiful in its own way. 2 years into their marriage, Sarah launched her own fashion label with Daniel's financial backing, but under her creative control. She made it clear from the start that while Daniel was her investor, all creative and business decisions were hers to make. She hired a small team, found a studio space in Manhattan, and slowly built a brand known for elegant, well-made pieces that were accessible to women of different sizes and budgets. She never forgot where she came from, and part of her business model included a mentorship program for young designers from low-income backgrounds, giving them the kind of support she'd once desperately needed. Daniel watched her build her empire with pride, never trying to control or manage her business, but always there when she needed advice or just someone to listen when she was stressed. He'd learned that supporting Sarah didn't mean fixing her problems or making decisions for her. It meant showing up, listening, and trusting her to handle her own life while knowing he had her back. For his part, Daniel found that being with Sarah had changed how he approached his own business. He became more thoughtful about the social impact of his developments, more interested in creating spaces that served communities rather than just generating profit. He started funding more charitable initiatives, particularly ones focused on education and opportunity for people from backgrounds similar to his own. Sarah had reminded him of who he'd been before success had hardened him, had reconnected him with the values that had driven him in the first place. They dealt with their share of challenges, as any couple does. There were arguments about money, about how much was too much to spend, about the balance between helping others and enabling dependence. There were moments when Sarah felt overwhelmed by the expectations that came with being Daniel Crawford's wife, times when she missed the anonymity of her old life. There were moments when Daniel fell back into old patterns of trying to solve problems with money rather than presence. But they worked through it all, sometimes with the help of a couple's therapist who helped them navigate their different backgrounds and communication styles. They learned to fight fair, to speak up when something bothered them before resentment could build, to remember that they were on the same team even when they disagreed about tactics. They learned that a strong relationship isn't one without problems. It's one where both people are committed to working through the problems together, and through it all, they never forgot where they started, with a wrong number and a willingness to be vulnerable with a stranger. They kept their old text messages, scrolling through them sometimes when they needed to remember why they'd fallen in love in the first place. They celebrated the anniversary of that first accidental message every year, usually by doing something simple, ordering pizza and staying in to talk for hours like they used to on the phone. Those moments of simplicity, of just being two people who loved each other, became their anchor in a life that could sometimes feel overwhelming in its complexity. 5 years after that first text message, Sarah and Daniel sat together in the living room of their home, not the penthouse where Daniel had lived alone for so long, but a brownstone in Brooklyn that they'd renovated together, creating a space that felt like both of them. Their daughter, Emma, named after Sarah's grandmother, was asleep upstairs, and they were having one of their regular evening conversations, the kind that had started their relationship in the first place. They talked about everything and nothing, about Emma's first words and Daniel's new community development project and Sarah's upcoming Fashion Week show. They talked about their dreams for the future, about maybe having another child, about eventually scaling back work to travel more, about growing old together. And as they talked, Sarah thought about how improbable their story was, how many small decisions and coincidences had led to this moment. If Jessica had written the number correctly, Sarah would have contacted the designer she'd been looking for, and she and Daniel never would have met. If Daniel had deleted that first message without reading it, none of this would have happened. If Sarah hadn't been brave enough to forgive him, or if Daniel hadn't been brave enough to be vulnerable, they would have lost each other. Their love story was built on a foundation of chance and choice, of fate and free will working together to create something neither of them could have predicted. Sarah looked at Daniel, this man who'd started as a voice on the phone and had become her partner in every sense of the word, and she felt overwhelmed with gratitude. Not for his money or the opportunities it had provided, though those were nice, but for him, for the person he was, for the way he loved her and their daughter, for the life they'd built together from that imperfect, beautiful beginning. Daniel caught her looking and smiled, reaching over to take her hand. He asked what she was thinking about, and Sarah told him she was thinking about wrong numbers and right destinies, about how sometimes the universe knows better than we do what we need. She said she was thinking about the girl she'd been 5 years ago, scared and struggling and hoping for a break, and how she wished she could tell that girl that everything was going to work out better than she could imagine. Not because a billionaire would fall in love with her, that would have terrified her, but because she'd find someone who would see her, really see her, and love what he found. Daniel squeezed her hand and said he'd been thinking about something similar, about the man he'd been before her, successful but hollow, surrounded by people but deeply alone. He said meeting her had saved him in ways that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with remembering what it meant to be human, to be vulnerable, to let someone in past all the defenses he'd built. Now let me ask you something. Have you ever had a moment where something went wrong that turned out to be exactly right? A missed train that led to meeting someone important? A rejected job application that pushed you toward something better? A wrong number that changed your life? Sarah and Daniel's story reminds us that sometimes our biggest blessings come disguised as mistakes, that the detours and accidents and things that don't go according to plan might actually be redirecting us towards something better than what we'd imagined for ourselves. It also reminds us that real love isn't about perfection or having everything figured out from the start. It's about choosing someone every day, even when things get complicated, even when you mess up, even when the path forward isn't clear. Sarah could have let Daniel's deception end their story. She had every right to walk away, to decide that the betrayal was too much to overcome. But she chose to look deeper, to understand his motivations, to give their love another chance. And Daniel, once he was confronted with his mistake, didn't make excuses or minimize Sarah's pain. He owned what he'd done, gave her space to process, and then fought for their relationship in a way that respected her agency and her feelings. That's what real love looks like. Not the fairy tale version where everything is easy and perfect, but the messy, complicated, deeply human version where two imperfect people choose each other over and over again. So here's what I want you to think about. If you're struggling in a relationship right now, whether it's romantic or otherwise, are you willing to do the hard work of honest communication? Are you brave enough to be vulnerable, to admit your mistakes, to fight for what matters? And if you're single, are you open to love showing up in unexpected ways? Are you willing to take a chance on something that doesn't look like what you thought you wanted, but might be exactly what you need? Sarah and Daniel's story started with a wrong number, but it became right because they both had the courage to be authentic, to be vulnerable, to choose love even when it was scary and uncertain. That kind of courage is available to all of us, in every relationship, every day. We just have to be brave enough to use it. If this story touched your heart, if it made you think about your own life or your own relationships, I want you to share it with someone who needs to hear it. Share it with someone who's given up on love, someone who's struggling to forgive, someone who needs to be reminded that beautiful things can come from unexpected places. And tell me in the comments, do you believe in destiny or coincidence? Have you ever experienced a wrong number or wrong turn that ended up being exactly right? I'd love to hear your stories. And if you're new here, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss more stories that will remind you that life is full of unexpected miracles if we're just brave enough to recognize them when they appear.